have to do here? Okay. All right. This is not supposed to be here. This is not the play. Play slideshow. Not working. Play the slideshow. I can't see. This should not be here. No. No, this is not working. You'd have to do the play the slideshow. It's not, she can't see. You have to play the slide. I haven't got my glasses either. No, this is not playing. Play from start. Okay. There we go. Can we pretend that didn't happen?
Can we open our eyes now?
Okay, hello everyone. We'll start from the beginning. My name is Aggie Day, and I'm a hidden child of the Holocaust. And these are just pictures that you'll see later on.
Did you use the mic?
Oh, it is on. Is it not on?
Yeah, it's on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll try and speak louder, Henry. How's that? So my family history on my mother's side begins in Hungary, and it is Hungarian. And this is just some pictures of my grandparents getting married, my mother's birth certificate, and this is a picture of my mother when she was 2 years old. And the reason I've included it is I think it's so cute and very strange for modern 2-year-olds. They don't quite dress like that. But I was not born in Hungary. I was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And this is my birth certificate, which I do not know how to read because it's in the Cyrillic alphabet. And of course, we use the Latin alphabet. So I've had this translated into 3 different languages. And a Jewish girl, when she's born, after 8 days becomes named in a synagogue. And I was named in a synagogue. And I always thought that the synagogue was a very small synagogue and that it had been destroyed during World War II. Lo and behold, when I was looking into the internet for my presentation, I found that it had not been destroyed. And as you can see, it's a large synagogue. So I thought that was very interesting. And later on, you'll hear a couple of other things about the internet. So the internet has some very interesting things to give us, and sometimes not, but we have to decide and choose. I actually wrote when I started to look into my past, and I wrote the synagogue to see if I could have any information that my birth certificate did not have. But the only thing that they gave me was exactly what was on here. Just a picture that I show to show you that Belgrade, which is now it is the capital now of Serbia, because Yugoslavia is no longer a country that exists. And just to show it's a cosmopolitan city with subways and so on. And this is a postcard from 1934, so it's way before I was born. Well, in 1941, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslavian soldiers, the army gave up very, very quickly, and Germany took over. Germans took over. I don't know exactly how long after the Germans invaded, but there was a knock on my parents' door, and they basically, 2 or 3, I don't know how many Nazi officers, informed my parents that we were to pack up and leave. I had an older sister, she was 13 at the time, and they told her just to leave. My mother, who was a very strong person, and she's the reason that I stand here before you, and she somehow convinced them that they should let us stay in a maid's room, the 4 of us, my father, my mother, my sister, and me. and she would cook and clean for them. Now, can you imagine somebody doing that? If any of you have seen Schindler's List, therein is the same situation, except those people actually left. And most people would have left. But my mother was not a person who was going to allow that. So she actually, and again, I don't know for how long, but certainly many weeks, she cooked and cleaned for these Nazi officers so that we would have a place to stay. Of course, in the meantime, she was making all kinds of plans with my father to try and escape. She was in touch with her mother in Budapest, and in Hungary, that was not happening, okay? So that was it was a different story in Hungary. My parents tried different ways. I know they tried to escape once. They were promised some lift, not a lift, a car would drive them. Well, that didn't pan out. Then they wound up having to go back. And of course, everything was a big secret. They couldn't tell anybody what was happening. And finally, they decided they had to leave because things were not panning out for them, and they started a long trek. They and many others started to walk from Belgrade to Budapest. That's 196 miles. My mother told me many stories about that. Sometimes I think they got some rides, most of the time not. My sister, who was 13, found a candy store, and all these stores had been totally abandoned. So grocery stores, candy stores, jewelry stores, clothing stores. But you can imagine, clothing stores, jewelry stores, not important. If there was a grocery store, and my sister said a candy store, which was left, people just went and got things out because they'd been abandoned. And so she found a whole bunch of candy and put them, I think, in my carriage and that way. And of course, my mother tried to carry me most of the time. She felt that was the best thing for her to do instead of putting me in the carriage. Anyway, they did arrive in Budapest. Now, why was it different in Budapest versus Belgrade? Because Miklos Horthy, who was an anti-communist leader, allied with Hitler. And there's a picture of Horthy and Hitler. He was very anti-Semitic. However, he decreed that Hungarian Jews who were citizens of Hungary, would not be deported. And that was the difference between Hungary and other countries. In June 1941, Hungary declared war on Russia. So basically, Hungary was an enemy of Russia. In August 1941, Hungary began deporting Jews without Hungarian citizenship. Now that was my father, because he was Yugoslavian or Serbian. December 1941, Hungary entered the war against the Allies. I think we all know who the Allies were. They were France, the USSR, Britain, and later on the United States. What was happening to the Jewish young men? What was happening to them? Well, in Hungary. In Hungary, they had work camps, very much like the camps of where the Jews were deported to. They worked them to death. They didn't feed them very well. And this is a picture of my uncle, my mother's brother. It was amazing when I found that picture because that he happened to turn around, because as you see, basically he and another man are turning around looking at the camera, and nobody else is. So I don't know. I don't know when he was exactly recruited, but he spent a number of years, a couple of years in the camps. Oops, I knew this would happen. because I have to go back, I'm sorry. I'm using the pointer that I'm not familiar with, so. Anyway, so at this time, we were living with my grandmother, and one day, one of the neighbors of my grandmother decided to report my father. Remember, he was Serbian. And he reported them to the Gestapo. And my parents went to the Gestapo because they were called to go there. And luckily, when they entered the building, my mother ran into somebody that she had known that she'd gone to school with. And he said to her, what is she doing there? I mean, why is she there? He knew she was Jewish. And she told him, and he said, turn around and get out of here, otherwise you'll never get out of here. And my parents did that exactly. That night, my father left us and went into hiding into the countryside. And what happened to the rest of the Jewish people in Budapest during this time while the young men were recruited and were not recruited, but worked in camps? I don't know I don't have that information. We just lived. And I guess I never asked. Unfortunately, didn't ask a lot of questions that I should have. And we survived somehow. But what was happening to the Jewish people in Budapest or in Hungary? Basically, teachers lost their jobs, professors lost their jobs, doctors lost their jobs. Children couldn't go to, they had to go to special schools or not go to school. The same thing that was happening everywhere in all the countries to the Jewish people. And that was how, I don't know, I guess I never, like as I said, I never asked how we survived, but we somehow did. And then war, and then actually in 44, Horthy was actually dismissed by Hitler, and the Arrow Cross Party came in. And they were even worse than the Gestapo. And they started deporting the Hungarian Jews. In fact, the Hungarian Jews were the last to be deported. And they were the last, in the last 9 months, they were the last to be deported. This is a small town, Közép, Hungary. And as you can see, the people are just, they're told to pack up and follow and go. And they went. They went like sheep, which is a very, very sad thing. And if any of you have read Elie Wiesel, who also at that time was deported, he was Hungarian, and he lived in a small town. And when I read his story, his book, he was very, very angry because by that time, he felt that people should have known enough not to follow because the news about being in deportation camps and what was happening to them had certainly reached these people, and yet here they were doing this. Well, when this happened, of course, my mother decided something had to be done. We had to go into hiding. Now, she had heard about a priest who was saving some Jewish women, who was had some Jewish women in a convent. And so she went to him, she approached the priest and told him that she would like him to please hide us. And he said, I'm so sorry, I just can't. He couldn't because the convent was filled and he just couldn't do that. Again, many, many people at that point would give up because they're told no, and what are they going to do? My mother was not of that ilk at all. So she tried to hide us in certain places, and she hid it. We were in hiding at one point in a hospital. I remember being in a crib, crying, and being in a strange surrounding. And that was a hospital, apparently, that we hid in for a few days. But she kept hounding and hounding this priest till finally he said, okay, I found a place for you. I found a place for your mother and your older daughter and you. But we can't have a little 4-year-old in the convent. And so he spoke to this young couple who said that they would take me and hide me. But before that, he couldn't, he found the place, but he couldn't exactly take us there at that time. So he said, I will take you into my apartment for a few weeks till I can place you in the convent. Now, he was living alone at the time in an apartment house, in an apartment. And by that time, Budapest was being bombed by the Allies. And interestingly enough, these big apartment buildings, and I don't know, I'm sure it's the same in many other cities in Europe, but they had these cellars. And so when there was an air raid, people would go into the cellars. And it seemed that all these apartment buildings they were set up that when people would go into the cellars, somebody was in charge to make sure that everybody who lived in the apartment would go to the cellars and they would be safe. And when there was an air raid, of course, the priest had to go into the cellar, and we had to hide in a bathroom which had no windows. In fact, my mother made a bed in the bathtub for my grandmother, because sometimes we were in there for quite a long time, many hours. And this went on for about, I don't know, 5-6 weeks. Now, the priest was living alone, and so only one person could walk at a time. And I was 4 years old. So one person could walk at a time. You could not talk, only in whispers, and only one person at a time. Can you imagine a 4-year-old being told to walk and not run, not play? A child of war is a very different child than a child of peace. A child of war, when they're told to do something, they do it. They don't ask questions, because no matter how young you are, you know that it's dangerous, you obey, and you feel the danger. And it doesn't matter what age you are. Very different than our children, our grandchildren, who like to run and ask questions and why can't we do this and why can't we do that? They just do. And the child of war is very, very different. So I did whatever I was told. So finally, he found the convent. I mean, there was room in the convent, and they went, my mother and my grandmother and my sister went into the convent, and I was taken by this young couple. Again, lots of bombings, lots of air raids. I remember the sirens. They had a horrible effect on me because they were very, very scary. Every time there was a siren, into the cellar. Can you imagine this young couple, they didn't have children, having to rely on this little girl and telling this little girl, well, do not talk to the people when we go to the cellar. Well, you know, people love to talk to little children. They love to say, how are you? What's your name? I was told to give a different name. They gave me a name. They told me to say that I was I was their cousin from the countryside. And that's all I was supposed to say. Of course, I had to answer when people said something. And they had to rely on this little girl, because had I said something like the truth, they would have been killed. So this young couple took their lives into their hands. At one point, they decided that they were going to leave Budapest because there was more food in the countryside. And what I remember is being taken to the train station and standing with them. And I was absolutely terrified because I would never see my mother again. I was going to be taken away somewhere to the countryside with them. And then lo and behold, the priest and my mother approached, and of course this had been arranged before, but nobody bothered telling me. Again, you know how we tell children, our grandchildren, children, we explain things to them, we say, the reason we're doing this is this, and so on. Again, very, very different at that time. Reasons weren't explained. This is what you do, this is what you say, etc. So nobody told me that the arrangements had been made that I wouldn't be going with them and never see my mother again. You can imagine how excited I was when I did see my mother. Unfortunately, right away, I had to be placed with another young couple because, again, there was no room in the no room in the convent. So for me, and I don't remember being hungry ever. I'm sure there wasn't much food. Obviously not. The first couple went to the country, but I don't remember being hungry. And I'm very, very grateful to these two young people who took me in like that. Obviously, they didn't have children. I think it was much harder, and there were many people who had children who saved Jews. And it's a very wonderful thing that these people did what they did. Now, the Hungarian Jewish population is very different than a lot of the Jews because well, first of all, 825,000 Jews lived in Hungary in 1941. By 1944, Allies were planning the Normandy invasion. 564,000 Hungarian Jews died. Murder, gas, most of them in Auschwitz, in the last 9 months of the war. So in 9 months. So 1/3 survived. And most of the ones that survived were from Budapest. The others, small towns, were all annihilated. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Raoul Wallenberg. He was a Swedish diplomat, and he saved many, many Hungarian Jews in Budapest. He created safe houses, Swedish safe houses, so the Germans couldn't come in because they belonged to Sweden. And he provided Swedish passports to them. And so a lot of the Budapest Jews survived that way. Finally, the war is over, 1945. And the USSR is the army that comes marching in. Remember, I told you that Hungary was an enemy of the USSR. So can you imagine, the war is over, people are happy there's no more bombing, but the USS Army is marching through Hungary, through Budapest. And I remember the march, one march. I was very little, of course, I'm 5 years old, and all I saw were the legs and the marching legs. And what I remember distinctly is the feeling. There was no happiness, no yelling, clapping, nothing when the army was marching through. You can imagine how the Hungarian population felt. I was very excited, and because I was going to see my mother, I knew that. But it was total quiet during this march. And you can see some, the city having been bombed. Whoops, so sorry. So this is a picture of my mother, my sister, and me during the Russian occupation. Somehow, my father got a hold of my mother, somehow, I don't know how, and he had been in hiding. This is now after the Russian occupation. And because there was no food in Budapest, my mother decided to send my sister and me to my father in the country because there would be some food. And we started the trek, and we were on a cattle barge, and it was November. We were wearing winter gear. It was pretty cold, and the cattle barge was overloaded, and we toppled over. And many people actually drowned. My sister was a great swimmer, so she managed to have me in her arms. She had to let go of all our clothes because she couldn't hold on to both. Somebody grabbed me actually and tried to pull me under, or just she was grabbing because she was drowning. Swam to the other side, and some farmers took us all in. And after a few days, I don't know, somehow my sister found my father and continued the journey. And my father was in camp with Soviet soldiers. And I don't know, I wish I knew again more of the story, because where he had been hiding, I have no clue. But there he was with the Russian soldiers, and they were very excited to see a child because they hadn't seen some of their families for about 3-4 years or more. And so I remember learning Russian songs. I remember learning Russian words. They held me on their laps. They were very excited. My father, of course, had to take very good care of my sister because she was not 5 years old. And soldiers, yes. But I don't know how long we were there, not all that long. And then we went back to Budapest to be with my mother. And the Russian, I'm sure that they helped my father escape from Hungary to Austria. And he established himself in Vienna, and my father and mother were able to write to each other, and he was trying to get us out legally because the Soviets, they just closed the borders. They started to take over, of course, the government. But to no avail, he tried very many to get us legally out. And my mother, as I told you, was not going to wait all that long, although it was a year. And she finally decided, this isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to get out legally. My father was not able to do that. So finally, my mother made plans for us to escape to Austria from Hungary. So from Budapest to the border is about 125 miles, and there's a lake there. And that's where we were brought over to the lake. And I remember this huge, huge rowboat, and it was at nighttime. We had to do it at nighttime. And I knew by that time, I was old enough, I knew that we would get shot. Again, very quiet, nobody has to say anything. There were a lot of people in that boat, as I recall. And I was told, I knew that we would get shot if we were caught. And we had to go in and out of the bushes, or the bulrushes, because anytime there was a little bit of a noise that we heard, we had to sort of be very quiet. But we actually made it. And there we were met by people and were taken to Bad Gastein, to a DP camp. Now, Bad Gastein is a small spa town in Austria. Austria, Hungary, Germany, they have many, many spas. People go to spas a great deal for vacations and so on. So Bad Gastein, if you see the hotels, there's a lot of hotels. They were all empty, of course, during the war. So that's where they put displaced, well, DP camp is displaced persons. And so they had about 2,000 people in Bad Gastein. The picture here is of me in the Hungarian costume doing the csárdás, which is the Hungarian folk dance. And this was a very, very well-organized camp. They arranged schools, they had all kinds of things. I mean, it was just a very well-organized place. In fact, this is the first time I went to school. So, of course, I had to learn German. I only spoke Hungarian. And my first report card, and I was 7 years old. So I didn't go to school till I was 7, which when I present to classrooms, the pupils are very, the students are very, they sort of look at me because they're 7 years old. They usually start school now at 4, you know? And so and I don't know what's my timing here. All right.
We're good.
We're good? We're good? Okay, thank you. So I tell this little story, and the kids really like that. So, I'm not allowed to do that, sorry. Well, we're being televised. Sorry, Richard. Anyway, the first line in here in that column is betragen, which means behavior. And if you see, it only says good. The next time it says sehr gut, which is very good. And most of the other things say very good, all the other subjects. And because this little story is that I came home after school one day, and I was all very excited because I told my mother, I was put on a special bench at the end of the classroom. And I was all excited. Of course, I thought it was very good. Of course, what happens, I talk too much. That hasn't changed, by the way. Anyway, after, I don't know how long, my sister met a GI, and she married, and we moved to Salzburg. And I don't know how many of you have been to Salzburg, but it's a wonderful, wonderful city. And we lived in Salzburg, and my nephew was born there. And I think we lived there about 1.5 years. And I saw my father sporadically, but my parents really weren't living together. He was in Vienna. And after about 1.5 years, my sister had to go, well, my brother-in-law was transferred. He was a GI. He was transferred back to the States. And so, of course, that meant my sister and my nephew were going back to the States. So my mother thought, okay, we're all going to the States. Well, no, that's not exactly what happened. We could not go because we were refugees. And they were not accepting Jewish refugees at the time. The United States wasn't. And my mother couldn't understand that because in those days, Europeans after the war thought America was America. They didn't really, most of them didn't know the difference that there was the United States and there was Canada. It was all America. And the streets were lined with gold, you know. That's just was the thought, and that's the way they thought. So my mother found out that was not the case. But again, being resourceful, she did all kinds of things, researched and went place to place. And in Toronto, Canada, there was a group of very, well, wealthy Jews, and they decided they would help bring some Jewish immigrants into Canada, into Toronto. And the only way, though, that they were able to take my mother is that she would have to work as a housekeeper for a couple, for a Jewish couple in Toronto for 1 year. And so, of course, she couldn't bring her daughter. So my parents decided that I would go to live with my father. Now, I did know my father, and I did know I loved him because we saw each other, but really I didn't know him very well. However, that was the decision, and I was going to live with my father. And so my mother left, and I went to live with my father. And this is a picture of my father. And he lived in Vienna. And this is a classroom that I'm in, and obviously here I'm dressed as a snowflake. And I grew to love my father very much, and I have wonderful, wonderful memories of being there. Of course, my mother and I, and my father, we were writing back and forth. My parents had to got a divorce. I mean, they were planning it, I'm sure anyway, but at that point they had to get a divorce because my mother left. And I have very, very wonderful memories of Vienna and of living with my father. But there was never a question that when the time came, I would be going to be with my mother. And after about 1.5 years and so on, my mother was able, well, she worked for 1 year, and then she went and got a job, and after that, she was able to show that she could support me. And so it was time for me to go and be with my mother. It was a very difficult time for my father and me, because I knew, and of course I loved my mother, was going to be with her, but to leave my father by that time was very difficult. So parting was very hard for both of us. So where was I going? I was going to be going from Vienna to Bremerhaven in Germany. My father, who by that time had money, he had a good business, and he tried to get me to go privately. And he could have sent me privately, but I was a Jewish refugee, and so that was not allowed. The way I had to go as a Jewish refugee to Canada. This journey of 622 miles took 5 months. 5 months. Why? Because I was a Jewish refugee and I had to go through all the steps. And the steps involved in various places that I was being transferred basically from orphanage to orphanage, or refugee children's, they were orphanages. And so that's my memory of 5.5 months of traveling till we reached Bremerhaven. They were not very pleasant memories, I can assure you. So there we were waiting in Bremerhaven for the ship that was actually going to take us to Canada. And here is a picture of the ship, the Anna Salen. Now, you remember I told you about the internet. I found this picture, the actual picture of the ship that I sailed on, which was amazing. And so this ship was not a huge ocean liner. It was an ocean liner, of course. And during the war, it had transported soldiers. And that's what it was used for. So it was not a fancy one at all. And then after the war, it transported refugees to different places all over the world. They went to South America, we were going to Canada, all different places. So I remember I was by myself from orphanage to orphanage, then in the Bremerhaven, and then, which is a port, Bremerhaven means port, haven means port. And we went onto the ship, and basically there were sort of two huge rooms, one for women, one for men, with bunk beds, and that's where we were sleeping. And I was taken to this couple and said, if you have any problems, just talk to them. And that was it. So this voyage took 9 days. And what I remember from this voyage was that I was very sick the whole time. It was a very, very rough voyage. The ship wasn't a huge, huge ship, so it was not a very pleasant experience. We arrived in Halifax, and in Halifax, I was put on a train. And luckily for me, there was another little girl that was traveling in the same direction. And so we sat beside each other. And that was very, very lucky for us. And remember, at that point, we spoke German to each other. I spoke no English, neither did she. So we had these little signs. I think there was money inside there. And the conductors were told, to take care of us. The first thing that the conductors did is they did get us pillows, because the train took 3 nights and 2 days. So we were sitting up for 3 nights, 2 days, but we had pillows. And every time the conductors changed, they were really great, because they went out, they got us food, sandwiches, because we could not speak at all. And I got off in Toronto, and this little girl went 100 miles further to London, Ontario. And I got off the train and with my little suitcase, and I didn't see my mother, because they didn't allow they allowed only passengers when you got off the train. And so I just saw footsteps, and I just followed. And I'm sure I must have been scared, but by that time I'd been alone for so much of the time. I didn't speak the language, but I just went. I could say hello, goodbye. I think that was it. Anyway, I followed the people, how they went in the direction, and they were sort of up a little ramp, and I went up, and there I was reunited with my mother. These are some identity. Again, I'm a refugee, fingerprinted and all that. And here is Anna Salen. That's my ship. That's how I knew that it was that ship. So in Toronto, I learned English, went to school, went to Jewish day camp at the JCC. Well, it wasn't called the JCC in those days, but it was YMHA. Thank you. Yes, the YMHA. And so I remember learning English songs. That was my first introduction, going to the camp, day camp. And so I lived in Toronto, gave birth to my daughter. And then we moved to Montreal. And there, I lived there for 10 years and gave birth to my son in Montreal. And then from Montreal, in 1978, moved to Seattle. And I've been here since. And I thought I always show my picture, some pictures of my family. This is my nephew in the red jacket over there. That he was born, remember the one? He was born in Salzburg. And that's one of my grandsons we're visiting. He lives near Toronto. And it's my granddaughter, my grandson and me, my daughter and her son, and then the same granddaughter and grandson and my son and my daughter-in-law. And I'd like to leave you with these words from John F. Kennedy, 1935, not 1935, sorry, 35th President of the United States. He delivered this at the American University, and I think this is so important for us all to remember. We cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit the earth, this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. We're all mortal. And I always end by saying to my audiences, please remember, we're all the same underneath. Our skins may be different, our religions may be different, we may look different, we may have curly hair, we may have straight hair. You know, take all that away, and what's underneath? We're all the same. Doesn't matter what religion you are, it doesn't matter what you look like. And that's the most important we have to remember, so we don't have another Holocaust. Thank you. Thank you.
So much. That was beautiful.
Whoops.
Okay, can we
Oh,
turn your microphone
yeah.
on?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
And you? Thank you, Aggie. That was remarkable. That was very, very moving to hear your story, your survival, your life, your passion. We're very impacted by you. Dear friends, good evening. I'm truly humbled to be here with you this evening. I'd like to thank, before we begin, Ms. Dee Simon and Ms. Ilana Cohen-Kennedy for inviting me to speak here this evening and to pray together in memory of all those who have perished in the Holocaust. At this point, I'd like to begin with the memorial prayer. If I can kindly ask you to please rise in honor for this prayer. We'll recite the prayer in both Hebrew and English, as we have been doing traditionally. El malei rachamim shochen bamromim, hamtzeh menucha nechona al kanfei hashechina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את כל הנשמות של 6 מיליוני היהודים חללי השואה שנהרגו, נשחטו, נשרפו ושנספו על קידוש השם בידי המרצחים הגרמנים ועוזריהם משאר העמים. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, בגן עדן תהיה מנוחתם, ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימין, ונאמר אמן. O God, who are full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest in thy divine presence to all the souls of our holy and pure brethren, whose blood was spilt by the murderers who killed, strangled, burnt, and buried alive for the sanctification of thy name. For whose souls we now pray, may their resting peace be in the Garden of Eden. May the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shadow of his wings for eternity, and may he bind their souls in the bonds of eternal life. Hashem is their heritage, and may they repose in peace in their resting places. Now let us say amen. You may take your seats. Thank you. I'd like to share a story of a survival by the name of Michael Bar-On. I viewed his testimony that he gave on Israeli television, and he gave his unbelievable story sitting aside his 10-year-old grandchild. He says when he was about 10 years old, they summoned them into the camps. At that point, he was separated from his family and put into a place where they were formulating 2 lines for groupings of A and B. Grouping A would mean that you would go to work and labor and survive, hopefully. Grouping B would be for the elderly and children that will ultimately not survive without any chance of survival. And so when he finds himself in grouping A, he turns to the work officer, which happened to have been a Jew, and says, please put me in group A. He says, you have to be 12 years old to go into labor here. You cannot go. You cannot belong in group A. If I do that, they'll kill me. They'll kill you. He says, well, if I remain in group B, I know I will have zero chance of survival. Please, what can I do? Who can I speak to? The only person, tells him the officer, is the head of the entire camp here. You will not survive. If you just face him, he'll shoot you. He says, well, it's better than having a certain death in grouping B. I will go face him. And he says that he put newspapers inside his shoes. He walked into his office, stretched as much as he could, approaches the officer and tells him, I humbly stand before you and request to go and work. The Nazi officer turns to him and says, you filthy Jew, you want to work? Tell me your age. He takes out a weapon. To the count of 3, you better tell me your age. 1, 2, what's your age? The boy stands up and he says, 12, I'm 12 years old. He takes out his weapon and blows a strong hit on this boy. Michael was standing right behind a desk and somehow does not fall to the ground and sustains himself with the desk behind him. And he stands up again and he says, 12, I am 12. The officer turns to him, puts his pistol away, and says, I know you're lying. I know you're not 12. But you stood up for what you believe in. You're a good boy. You can go to labor. Says Michael Bar-On, he later on went from one miraculous event to the next, eventually ended up, after many, many challenges and things that he cannot explain how they worked, he ended up in Israel in 1944, a year before the end of the Holocaust. From there, eventually, he graduates into enrolling into the army, serves in the army for 22 years as a high lieutenant, after which he's enrolled and accepted as the second-in-command operating officer of Bar Ilan University. And they asked him, are you sad? He said, I am not sad, because I was a higher lieutenant than the one that nearly took my life. Friends, the Holocaust Memorial has 2 modes that we know of today. It is called either Yom HaShoah, the day of the Shoah, the day of the Holocaust, or it is also coined as Yom HaGevurah, the day of courage and strength. What I heard this evening just before me, what I see in front of me tonight, is that we can take the Shoah as a memory of pain, loss, and suffering, but at the same time, we can attach to it courage, identity, strength, futuristic understandings of hope and life. Today, I am even more empowered by the story I have heard to embark on a journey of courage, of resilience, of strength. And I join you as I join the miraculous events that we heard today in becoming more affiliated with my own tradition, with the inheritance, with what we have been given as a nation that survives, a nation that is proud of where they came from, and that is not ashamed to show their true identity. Thank you all for having me, and have a beautiful evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for those beautiful and very thoughtful words. Glasses now. There is a tradition in Judaism to light a candle as a memorial for those who have died. If you are joining us online, I invite you to please light a candle with us. I'm honored that we have descendants of Holocaust survivors with us today who will be lighting candles today in honor of family members that they lost in the Holocaust. I will be calling them up in pairs. And as I call you up, if you are comfortable, please share the name of the person or people for whom you are lighting a candle for today. Okay, we'll start with Laura Hansen and her mother, Lily. And also Margot McVicker-Whelan. Would you like to tell us who you're lighting a candle for today?
The Diamond family from Warsaw, Poland, the Zonkiers, and the Trachtenbergs.
Wonderful, thank you. Hi, Margot.
My grandparents, Tekla and Louis Tenbrink, who were murdered in Auschwitz.
You want me to light it for you? These ones are a little tricky. You have to do like both at the same time.
I tried the top and the bottom.
Yeah.
You have to keep holding on to it for.
Miss the matches, right? Okay, I'd like to invite up Jeff Sprung and his mother, Charlotte Wolheim, and Peter also, and Daphna Roban. Hi, Charlotte. Would you like to tell us who you're lighting a candle for?
For my grandmother and my grandfather.
I'm lighting candles for my grandfathers, Hugo Friedman, Jacob Kraus, and my uncle, Andor Friedman.
I'd like to next invite up Stan Schill with his daughter Stacy and Steve Koenig.
Yes, for Helen Tobe, and Helen was my wife's ex-mother-in-law, and actually for the Strasser family, and also for Leslie Strasser, who was working here at the Holocaust Center as well.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'm going to be lighting a candle for Anton Schmid, who was born in Vienna in 1900 and helped save Jews from 1938 to 1942 when he was caught and executed at that time. And he is honored in Israel at Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations.
I'd like to next invite up Irene Madelon Monroe and Gordon and Mahal Lotskar.
I'm lighting a candle in memory of my grandparents who were murdered at Auschwitz. Irène Nar Florentin, and Moïse Florentin.
We're lighting candles to honor our extended families that perished in Auschwitz and in Belzec, Engelbergs, Neustadtels, Burgers, and Elboms.
I'd like to invite up next Eileen Putter and Marie Stromberg-Wojcik.
I'm lighting in memory and honor of my grandparents, Babette and Albert Sommerhauser, who died in Theresienstadt and were from Nuremberg.
I'm honoring my grandmother and my grandfather, Helena and Marian Wojcik. My grandmother survived, and it's her 96th birthday this week. So it's special, also in honor of her birthday. And my great-grandparents, Dominique and Joseph Kozlau, who were killed, actually, and murdered because they were harboring Jewish children on their farm in Ukraine.
Next, I'd like to invite up Ellie Greenberg and Leon and Debbie Zainwell.
I'm honoring my father, who survived, and the Zainwell family, and the Pytel family, and the Samuels family.
I'm lighting this candle in memory of my grandfather, Joseph Greenglass, who survived Auschwitz, and in memory of his parents and siblings who did not survive, as well as lighting it in honor of my grandmother, Relly Greenglass, who was a hidden child, and in memory of her parents who did not survive.
Thank you to all of our candle lighters. And I would now like to invite everyone to please take the little candles that were at your seat. And if you are watching online, please feel free to find a candle and light it with us. When we light these candles, we remember the souls who were lost, and we breathe light into their memories. We also remember those who suffered, whose lives were forever changed and altered by the pain and suffering inflicted and by the loss of their loved ones. Six million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust, and millions of non-Jewish people who were targeted because they were Roma and Sinti, or were gay, or suffered from mental illness, or physical disabilities. And today, on this Yom HaShoah, we remember their lives. If we estimate that there are 50 people in this room, each holding a candle, then we can estimate that each candle represents the lives of more than 120,000 people. That little candle in your hand, it's a reminder, and it's our responsibility now to carry these memories and lessons forward. I'm so grateful to all of you for coming tonight and for watching online, for listening to these stories, for remembering, and for looking around at the world, at humanity, and considering how we can do things better. As you leave this room tonight, please place your candle by the memorial, which is in the back of the room there, by the wall. There's a table back there. And if you would like, please take a moment to write a note or a name and place it in the wall. Thank you all for coming this evening. This concludes our program for tonight.